several years ago when 4 hunters did that very thing. They were accused of trespassing, that their act of traversing through his airspace caused $7 million worth of damage to his ranch.
Kyle Thiermann here. I'm in Cape Town.
I was the only journalist in northern Nigeria.
Not an adventure until you get lost in Tijuana.
If you get caught inside by a giant wave, you feel really alone.
I love the adventure of waking up and not knowing what will happen and that being my job.
Kyle Thiermann Show.
All right, and away we go. Devin O'Dea. How do you pronounce your last name, by the way?
OD.
O'Dea, Devin O'Dea. Well, the first jumping off point is actually going to be coming from a question that we have from our mutual friend Dylan Snyder from out in Montana, who I met Dylan when he was working at Backcountry Hunters Anglers, and he said, get him to tell you about the time the shark followed him in the kayak.
Yeah, we can definitely start there, man. So I'll have to give a shout out to my friend Dylan too, who put me on my first wave in Missoula, Montana. So what's up, Dylan? I'm glad you asked that question. Yeah, I caught a yellowtail a couple years ago on my kayak out in La Jolla, and his first yellowtail, I like dragged it up from the bottom. It was like this long fight, and actually I almost lost it too because it was the last cast of the day. I told my buddy, I was like, I got to get in. I told my wife I'd be home for dinner, and then ended up hooking up with this yellowtail after sending a live mackerel to the bottom. The first hook actually snapped, and I caught him with the second one in the belly. So I pulled him up sideways for like 40 minutes. Finally got him in the boat, in the kayak. And then a 10-foot hammerhead came in like maybe 30 seconds later and just started circling. And at this point, my good friend, my neighbor, asked me if I wanted to start fly lining the rest of his mackerel to catch the hammerhead. And I was like, get out of here, man. Come on. But he was serious too.
Have you ever seen a hammerhead before?
That was the first for me.
Wow. Are they common in La Jolla?
I think you hear about them every year or two. They come out. I'd never seen one. I think they're typically like guys that fish will see them, but I don't think it's super common with surfers. Well, every once in a while on the cove,
No.
You'll hear about them.
That's cool, man.
Yeah,
I've never seen a hammerhead. I've never seen one of those in real life.
We got some great footage too. We just stuck the GoPro in the water, and he just swam around and around, and he followed me all the way into Big Rock. So it was probably like we were about 2-3 miles out. It was a long paddle in, and I was not going to give up that yellowtail. I always wanted to get one, and so yeah, I felt bad though coming in through the lineup.
Yeah,
Hammerhead dogging me. I was like, sorry guys, like it's
some
trail I could do.
That's classic. Have you ever seen a great white?
I have once spearfishing, ironically, down here in La Jolla as a juvenile. Like I grew up in the North Bay area. Grew up abalone diving and surfing, and abalone diving is kind of what got me into everything really. But I saw a juvenile great white when I was spearfishing in La Jolla once. We like both went down after the same fish, and literally it was like a cartoon, just kind of like both at the same descent, like looked at each other and paused, and then like I just kind of like he went one way, I went the other way, and I just sort of went backwards and marveled for a minute, and then I let him have it.
Did it look like he did not have an aggressive posture, so it wasn't a very frightening experience?
It was startling and like adrenaline pumping, but no, I thought I would be a lot more freaked out. It was just I was more just kind of excited, and but I did decide to just slowly make my way out of the water. I mean, he was only like 7 or 8 feet, so like a true juvenile.
Cool. That's super fun. Well, let's talk about app diving. I didn't know that was the first doorway into conservation for you. So tell me about how you got into app diving and what that led to.
Yeah, it's it's bittersweet because abalone is closed right now. So every time I think about abalone diving, it's this like longing for a time long ago.
Really?
And I got into ab diving from a family friend who took me out when I was in high school and got me my first abalone. We had eaten abalone at their house plenty of times, and so, even before I went diving for it, I had just, like, the taste, and, to this day, abalone is my favorite food.
Yeah.
He
Hit it
he
with a hammer, bread it,
Yeah.
the whole process, yeah.
Yeah, and there's tons of different ways you can do it too once you kinda pound it out.
Mm.
It's pretty versatile. But, yeah, so, grew up ab diving north of San Francisco, and back then, the regulations were already getting tighter and tighter. It was already north of SF, and then it was getting further north and further north, um, until, it was around a decade ago, they closed it, and, closed it for an extended period of time, and, that's just been something that every year I wonder, like, "Oh, I wonder if we'll get abalone back,
Mhm.
what's it look like?" And the Fish and Game Commission in California actually just the Marine Resources Committee actually just looked at this, and it doesn't look like we're getting abalone anytime soon. They were talking about a potential 10-year extension to the closure, so
Wow.
we're gonna have to keep waiting on that one.
It's so crazy to think about. I got, I think, 2 seasons when I was younger going up to, to, like, Ocean Cove and some of those spots that, the big ab diving spots. And it was right when I was getting into spearfishing too. A couple friends of mine in Santa Cruz were part of this club called the Santa Cruz Kelp Stalkers, and they're a local spearfishing group in Santa Cruz. So they would go up with a crew and learned about it. It's such a fun and, like, such a storied animal, like, from all the tribes to how they interact with the kelp into the urchin story. Like, actually, very similarly, that was when I started thinking about ecosystems. Some of my earlier spearfishing experiences were up there ab diving, and then it was just like that. And it was like, boom, they're closing it. I'm like, okay, well, it'll probably just be for a season or something like that. And now I have some of these old photos on my phone of, like, ab diving with friends on there, and it's like a lifetime past.
Yeah, really, it feels like another lifetime. I was always too chicken to spearfish at that age.
Hmm.
Just being up there, I don't know, I was afraid of sharks or something, but the idea of putting blood in the water, when I was, yeah, at that age, I was just like, "No, no, thanks, I'll stick to the abs." It wasn't until I got to Santa Barbara that I started spearfishing, and that was, like, really I think the catalyst for me of realizing, like, "Wow, I can feed myself, like, I can get a lot of food doing this,"
Mhm.
uh, which equated to, more beer money and, things of that nature in
Yeah.
college, so it was a win-win at that point.
Where did you go to college?
I went to UC Santa Barbara.
Cool. So that was when you got into it, and you just dive all around there. Great way to get chicks.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, a girl I was dating at the time, to go into some more shark stories, they had this beat up old canoe, and, they let us borrow it one time when I had some friends in town. We went out, to Devereaux before it was a marine protected area. You can't fish it now. But, we ended up fishing, catching a bunch of fish, and this kid who was spearfishing out there ended up shooting a 7 gill, shot it right through the belly, and then so we were in the canoe and helped him pull it in. He, like, hopped in our boat. We helped him pull it in, and we thought maybe he'd shot, like, a little leopard shark or something, as he told us, "Hey, hey, I shot a shark, I shot a shark," and then, we pulled this thing in and we saw, like, that big old 7 gill jaws, and so, I kinda went into action and helped him land this thing, and then, it was so heavy that we had to run back and grab some skateboards, and so we wheeled this bloody, beat up old canoe with a 7 gill shark in it on skateboards, through Isla Vista, and then, returned that canoe, like, half full of shark blood, so I felt pretty bad about that, but, I was dating the girl at the time, so she forgave me.
Great Isla Vista story.
Yeah, classic IV.
So, what was your first aha moment when it came to conservation and this? I would go so far as to say, like, this philosophy. When did that hit you? Was that from spearfishing in Santa Barbara? Was there a big aha moment for you?
I think I think like subconsciously in Santa Barbara, it was kind of filtering through. I mean, I grew up backpacking and fishing for mountain trout and, um, like I said, ab diving and then spearfishing in Santa Barbara. And those things were all like, it was always about the food and the experience and the adventure. Um, I never really had a mentor though. It's kind of like the only person in my family to really do that. And so I think in the absence of the mentor, it took a little while for me to really get there. Um, I'd say it was when I had my daughter, my first daughter, that something really flipped. Like it all of a sudden, I just became way more conscious of the resource, the interconnectedness, my place in the food chain, my career, what I was doing in my life, like, and then yeah, it just became a lot more conscious of my actions and wanted to be ensuring that I was leaving some of the resource and yeah, contributing to conservation so that hopefully she'd want to go hunt and fish with me one day, or at least there'd be something for her to go hunt and fish
Mm.
maybe when I was gone.
And when did you learn about Backcountry Hunters and Anglers?
So BHA I learned about when I moved to San Diego, and I'd been bow hunting for a few years trying to kill a deer in Southern California, which is not easy. And not having very much success. I'd shot a couple rabbits with my bow, but that was it. And I'd put in, hundreds and hundreds of hours with no success. And then a friend of mine mentioned that BHA was having a pint night and that I think they even had like a first beer was free or something. So it was a pretty easy sell. I went and learned a little bit more about conservation and realized it's a great organization, from what I could tell. And just started volunteering with the
Mm.
local board and put on a couple events. And from there, I just met people that really started to like bring me into that conservation journey and to teach me about, you know, capital W wilderness and
I
conservation designations and, all the different aspects of public lands and why we have them and why they're important.
Mm. And what is capital W wilderness?
So that's a designation, a federal designation that's, lauded by many, in like the hunting, angling, environmental world as like the most significant conservation designation. So, it allows the least amount of human footprint. So it's kind
Um,
of as close to the true wild as you can get. And there, for better or worse, right? There are certain aspects of it. There's no motorized vehicle access, and sometimes that can be a little bit tricky when you want to do hands-on restoration, and there's a little
mm.
bit more red tape there or green tape. But ultimately, it's yeah, when you go deep into the wilderness, when you're doing a backpacking trip, way out there, oftentimes you'll be in true federally designated wilderness, which
Mhm.
is preserving that land, as close to kind of the natural character as possible.
Sure. And did you, I mean, because you're getting deer tags, did you fully understand the North American wildlife, conservation model prior? And I'll ask that question just with, like a little bit of backstory from me. So I grew up making a lot of these environmental films. Like grew up as a surfer, started making these short docs on like plastic pollution and ways surfers could get involved. And there were a lot of really great organizations that I became a part of. Still, a lot of directors of those organizations that I'm friends with today, to this day, and um, many of them just they rely on generous donations from people, but there's no broader system put in place and no broader funding mechanism for conservation. And it wasn't until my 20s that I got into hunting, that I got into spearfishing, that I really learned about the tag system. And as this kind of like, earnest youth environmentalist, that idea sort of blew my mind. Like the idea that you could pay into a system that could help fund conservation seemed like it was so far ahead of many of these other forms of environmentalism, conservationism, and I felt like it was a really big miss because at that time I didn't know much about hunting. I think that things have changed significantly over the past 10 years, but I think hunting has had a really bad PR problem from the outside in, with non-hunters thinking that it's just, a bunch of assholes that want to kill animals and get big trophies for their wall, not really understanding the good that it does every day and how many wild spaces it keeps open, how many species it keeps intact through your participation in this system. And I still feel like I'm really excited to talk to you because I feel like I still have so much to learn about getting involved with this system. But anytime you can get incentives aligned with good, you have a greater chance at the world not just turning into some kind of scorched hellscape.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most interesting ways to frame the North American model and the perspective and the opinion of a lot of hunters and anglers on that model is, there's this real sense of pride and ownership and just the uniqueness of that model to North America is something that people, yeah, talk about all the time, and they truly wear it as a sense of pride. But I think the example for me, um, that you see time and time again, even this year across different legislatures in the West, hunters and anglers have advocated for fee increases to go hunting and fishing. So I don't know of any other example for any other sport or activity or whatever it is that you like to do, that anyone goes out there, takes their own time to testify in front of the legislature to say, yes, please charge me more for the thing that I love to do, that I would do every year, that I've centered my life around. This is what I choose to do on my vacation. I'd like to pay, another 50%, 70%, please. And that's the way it goes because hunters know that those conservation dollars are going to work and they're benefiting the species that they're out there pursuing, and that it's, that it's a true pay to play system that they recognize that those contributions will have a tangible impact on the wildlife species that they're out there pursuing.
Mm. So what you said you had this aha moment as many young fathers do. So I hear that you're like, oh God, it doesn't just end with me. We gotta leave something behind, which is, a logical thought to have. Um, what what was the step from there to then actually working at BHA?
Yeah, so at the time I was working for as a marketing manager for a division of Mitsubishi,
Mm.
and kind of got there in a roundabout way. But when I graduated UCSB in 2011, economy was pretty tricky. Couldn't really find a job. I ended up starting a skateboard company in San Diego. That's why I moved down here. Started with my college roommate at the time,
Cool.
making bulletproof skateboards. So made them out of Lexan. We tested them with an AR-15.
Sick.
Ran them over with an El Camino. They're truly bulletproof, and I did that for 3 years, and then I kind of cut my teeth in the marketing world there, just trial by fire, getting that company off the ground, and then from there I worked in the environmental consulting world for a little bit in marketing, and then dabbled in like archery, and ended up with this archery division of Mitsubishi that did archery and golf. And I was the marketing manager there doing, all the various aspects of marketing and branding and graphics and stuff. And because they were an archery division, I kind of twisted some arms at the time to say, hey, like we're a, quote unquote, a hunting brand. Why don't we give back to conservation?
Mhm.
We've had record profits the last few years. I'm like, let's skim some off the top here and put it into conservation. And that was well received, and they said, yeah, that's great. Who should we donate it to? And I said, well, I know this great organization called BHA. And so I got us set up as a corporate partner, and in the process there got to design some arrows for BHA that we donated, that I am still shooting today. Actually, I harvested a deer and a few antelope with those arrows. So
Mitsubishi arrows.
Yeah, it's technically like Victory is the brand, but, made by Mitsubishi because
Mm.
they do the, carbon fiber pre-preg, so it's, like,
Mm.
whole vertically integrated, right, from, start to finish. And then, so from there, I got to know the folks at BHA, and while I was talking to, the former, development coordinator there, Grant Albin, he mentioned he had to reschedule a call because they, were gonna float the Smith River as an organization, and everyone was gonna go hunting and fishing and camping along the Smith for a retreat for a week.
Which
And
I hear is if you get that invite, you should absolutely go.
yeah, and so at this point, I'm like, "Wait a second, this is your job? Like, that sounds pretty great. Like, what am I doing? I only get 7 days of PTO a year, and that includes my sick time. That's, that sounds a lot better." And so I had mentioned, "If you guys are ever hiring, let me know." And it was around the same time that I'd had my first daughter, and, yeah, he's like, "Oh, well, we posted the California coordinator position yesterday, actually." So just
Mm.
serendipitously kind of when I had asked, they just posted this position and I applied and was hired on as the California coordinator. And I did that for 2 or 3 years, and then more recently was promoted into the Western Policy and Conservation Manager position, which is the role that I currently have with BHA.
Mm. And how does BHA um, differentiate from an organization like Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Ducks Unlimited, these various other players in the hunting conservation space? How would you define BHA?
We're an organization, we're a 501(c)(3) nonprofit, like a lot of these groups. We're newer than many of them. So we were founded in 2003 around a campfire in Oregon. And the real differentiator, I think, right off the bat is that we're not a species specific organization. So, you got the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever, the Mule Deer Foundation, Ducks Unlimited, so on and so forth, right? A lot of these just incredible nonprofits that do amazing work, that are focused on singular species, but that also do like a lot of different work. And there's overlap on, issues relating to public lands and access. Um,
Habitat restoration for elk is
habitat,
probably going to have a benefit for other species as well.
absolutely. Yeah. And not just game species, right? Like what's good for the bird is good for the herd. And so a lot of these, projects are improving habitat for endangered species too, which is, I think people don't always realize that. But I think, the other thing that really sets BHA apart is that we are um, really from the ground up a grassroots organization. So the structure and the model of BHA is centered around empowering volunteers to really drive the mechanisms and the day-to-day work of the chapters from a policy, stewardship, fundraising, and those volunteers are empowered. They really have a lot of kind of wiggle room to engage on issues and to do projects that they care about that are, within the umbrella of the organization. But it's just people are our greatest asset. And we have just like the most dedicated, amazing, inspiring volunteers that allow the organization to truly kind of punch above its weight class
Mm.
as far as what we financially bring in. We don't have really huge donors. We don't our money is coming primarily from these membership dollars from people that are supporting the organization and passionate about the work. And there's obviously various funding sources. We have grants and stewardship work and a whole breadth of the financial portfolio and amazing corporate partners that support our work as well. But that's, I think, the one thing that really sets the organization apart is that just really, truly grassroots nature, which then, helps a lot with the advocacy that we do,
Mhm.
in the federal and state level.
You mentioned ear- uh, earlier that you were volunteering at an organization. I think you said when you were much younger, which I wanted to I want to talk about the idea of volunteering a bit more, and the idea of volunteering as a habit that can be built. I think about this a lot because like it's easy to get kids involved in conservation because they're at school and, it's a day to go out and have a field trip and learn about the birds, learn about the seals. But as people get older and the clutches of busyness just continue to bear down, I think it's really easy for people to forget about the world beyond themselves and their jobs and just the immediate things in front of them. And there's so much that can be gained from building a habit of volunteering and building a habit of joining an organization. Had that always been kind of inherent to you as a young guy, like volunteering, or did that idea become more pronounced after BHA?
Great question. You know, I think I think my parents were big on volunteering, although I don't have, tons and tons of memories of going out, every weekend to volunteer, probably because they were, taking me to soccer practice and doing all the things that you do as a kid. But my dad was the executive director of Amnesty International in Washington, D.C. for, quite some time. And then I worked at a number of different nonprofits. And so, I think through his work, I certainly was exposed to more volunteerism, although not in the conservation space, more in the human rights
Mm.
space. But I think it did instill in me, kind of deep down the significance and the importance of kind of giving back and the role that nonprofits can play in affecting change. Right. I think that was probably maybe the largest takeaway is the power of nonprofits and the importance of fundraising to support that mission. And I remember when I was a kid in middle school and we learned to play the recorder, I went to Berkeley and we played recorder on the corner to fundraise for the nonprofit my dad was working at the time, following Amnesty International, is the Save a Foundation, which is like dedicated to restoring sight to the blind. And we played recorder on the corner to like fundraise, right? And we actually made a lot of money. I think people were just like paying us to shut up. They're like, stop playing Jingle Bells. It's July. Like,
Also, maybe the most Berkeley story I've ever heard.
yeah,
We were
exactly.
playing, we were playing a recorder on the corner for a nonprofit in Berkeley.
Yeah.
What is the power of a nonprofit like BHA? And I'll give you the opportunity to. I'm going to give you the opportunity to either can go two directions here. We can talk about the checkerboard right now, or we could talk about bighorn sheep.
Oh man, you're gonna make me decide. I may have to try to squeeze in time for both, but so I
We
would
can
say
we can talk about both. I
All
just
right.
know you're involved in both of them, so you can
Yeah,
tell two stories now.
cool. No, I love it. I think so. Let's talk about bighorn sheep because I think this is one that has allowed me in my position to really do a hands-on project to support um, an endangered species, which I just think most people would not really expect a hunting organization to be putting time into habitat restoration and removing barriers to movement for um, the peninsular bighorn sheep, because this is not a species that you can hunt. You can hunt desert bighorn sheep. Peninsular bighorn sheep are a genetically distinct subspecies that you cannot currently hunt because they're federally listed under the Endangered Species Act. And so BHA has done a number of different habitat projects to improve the population of peninsular bighorn sheep that are located in Southern California, in and around Anza Borrego Desert State Park and the Peninsula Range. One of those projects is a wildlife crossing over Interstate 8 that we're currently in the middle of working with, state and federal agencies, other NGOs, UC Davis, Road Ecology Center. This like broad coalition of folks that have all come together. The Wildlife Conservation Board gave us a multi-million-dollar grant to plan and design this wildlife crossing that will benefit Peninsula Bighorn sheep who tend to have their lambs between two lanes of I-8. And there's like a split in the mountains where the ewes will actually go and have their lambs, and then the ewes and lambs will cross the roadway as they go to their summer and winter migration stopovers and looking for water, looking for forage. And so they get hit there all the time. And it's dangerous for people. There was a fatality there within the last year from a person hitting a bighorn sheep. There's a number of sheep that are killed every year. There was one that was killed yesterday. And this population is under 1,000 sheep, right? So every death is a significant event. And this is just an interesting project, I think, that, came about because of a biologist who we were working with at the time, who just told me, she said, look, I'm just tired of scraping sheep off of the freeway. Like, you got to do something about this. And at the time, we were working with the Marines out of Camp Pendleton to fly helicopters into wilderness to replace water development structures like guzzlers for the sheep. And I mean, that story in itself is wild because it was, there's these sheep populations, again, that were dying for a different reason because of drought. And these water systems had been going dry. They just didn't have any water during the drought of 2021, 2020. And the Marines, because of a volunteer with the California chapter of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, reached out, had connections, got it approved by the general, and the Marines for the last 4 years have been flying helicopter support into wilderness along with the California chapter of the Wild Sheep Foundation and a bunch of state and federal agencies, CDFW. But yeah, it's just a really cool example of how one person from an NGO can reach out to their network to make something monumental happen, whether it's, working with the Marines or, setting up a meeting with all these interested parties to apply for funding from the Wildlife Conservation Board for a wildlife overpass. It's amazing to see these things snowball and take off and then have those tangible impacts for species.
Wow. Yeah, I'm sure you've had a chance to see a few of those stories kind of play out over the course of months or years, and then most people just get, the headline and double tap it on their Instagram feed and then on to the next thing. But you have a really unique window into how conservation changes on a real level, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I think it's, it's easy for people to just say, I think, like, oh, well, it's the government will do it, right?
Mm.
It's like the Department of Fish and Wildlife. That's their job. Like, they'll save the sheep. But they're dealing with funding challenges, and they've only got so much that they can do, and so oftentimes it's without support from dedicated volunteers or NGOs. It just doesn't happen. There's only so much that our agencies can do, and they do a tremendous amount. But also, it's on us to elect people that are going to fund those agencies. And historically, California does a pretty good job. It waxes and wanes, but that is not always the case in different states, and then the federal government. It certainly is a political football as far as funding goes.
Sure. So that, do you find that if you have, I'll ask, this question. If there is a president that is more conservation minded, how does that affect BHA?
It's I'll say that, the work that we do is the most refreshing thing about it is that the organization is truly nonpartisan. And so if a president or an administration enacts legislation or policies that are pro-conservation, we're going to give them a round of applause and we're going to celebrate that to our membership. If an elected official is doing something that is not good for public lands, waters, wildlife, we are going to, unleash the grassroots to tell their elected officials that, hey, I don't support this. And so, it really varies. And I'll say that the nonpartisan nature of the work is something that oftentimes really unites people from very disparate political leanings. And so oftentimes on these projects, you have very left-leaning environmentalists, very right-leaning conservatives that are coming together with a common goal of, yes, like we clearly want to ensure that, this mule deer herd is going to safely migrate across this freeway. Um, or, like we support this funding to improve conservation for a particular species. And so I think that's one of the most refreshing things. It doesn't always work that way. There's certainly things that get fought over, and it's not all sunshine and rainbows, but sometimes it can be really interesting to see disparate user groups come together and people with different, ideologies um, celebrating conservation.
Um, what do you mean by, we unleash the grassroots membership? So I asked you earlier when we were chatting, I said, does writing a letter do anything? He said, yes, it does do a lot, and there's even more that people can do. Because I sign up for email lists, I'm on social media. I get the calls to action, and so often maybe it's just a sense of feeling small, or a sense of nihilism. Like, why would I even take the 2 minutes to fill out this pre-written letter and click a few buttons and send it off? So what's the argument that actually can make a difference?
Well, I'll lead into this by saying that conservation is not convenient. Is not my phrase, but it's so true. I think that might be a Jim Posowitz phrase, but I'll have to check my source there. But it's it's not easy to affect change at times. It can be easy to take action on something, to send a letter to your elected representative regarding legislation or a policy proposal. Uh, you know, whether it's positive for conservation, like a new wilderness, or large landscape level conservation, or something that's negative, like eliminating something like that. But it, any action that you can take is going to be positive. Like, your elected officials are looking to their constituents for what they support, and it's going to be in their best interest to support those things. Otherwise, they're not going to get reelected. So, more than anything, the power that you have as a constituent, I think people underestimate how significant their voice is to their elected official. To another elected official in another district, they might not care at all what you think, right? Like, if you're taking action on something that you're not a constituent of, your voice is going to count, but not nearly as much as to your elected official. And so I think that's one piece.
That's a really good
Right.
point. I'm happy you said that.
Yeah, like, and so, like, writing a letter and calling your elected official is significant. It's important, especially when you can go beyond the form letter and just, the easy action is just, I'm gonna click yes, I'm gonna take action, and then keep scrolling or do whatever I'm doing, go check the surf. If you can customize that, tell your own story, that adds another layer. It gets you out of the noise of, like, oh, we got 500 of the same message, like a bunch of, especially in today's day and age with AI, I think those types of inputs are less and less significant. The customized message lands. Beyond that, actually showing up, even just virtually, like, there's a lot of opportunities these days to virtually comment during a committee hearing, maybe a commission hearing, even down to the county level. Like, a lot of things are happening at the county level. It doesn't have to be, the biggest issue, but a lot of these policies and ideologies are being formulated at those levels, and it's important to make your voice heard. And so I think, beyond just the letter, actually getting into the process and getting your voice out there really is significant, because sometimes on a particular piece of legislation, depending on what's going on, there may only be a few people that testify. And your testimony might actually be the thing that yeah, makes it out, helps the bill get out of committee. And then, maybe then it gets a vote on the particular floor. And it might be the, thing that actually gets this legislation to the next step. Whereas if no one was there and no one cared, they might just kind of table it and move on.
Sure. My girlfriend wins raffles constantly because turns out no one signs up for raffles. So she's like,
Yeah,
has
no
like a
kidding.
1 in 3 chance of winning every single raffle, and she usually wins.
Yeah, raffles are usually a pretty good way to get some great stuff.
Um, let's talk about this is very topical, and I reached out to you maybe 6 months ago because I got involved in an issue that was kind of right at my the place I learned how to spearfish, Pleasure Point, Santa Cruz, some really fun, nice rockfish, lingcod you can get out there. And a friend of mine told me about a proposal to turn it into a no-take MPA, which has become now, it's a statewide issue, and it's a very heated issue that BHA has gotten involved with. And that was how I think I originally maybe reached out to you to get your perspective on this. Can you outline, what, I know maybe this is too big of a question, but what that issue is and where it stands right now, and where BHA stands on that issue?
Yeah, I'll try to give the high level overview, and we can always go into more detail. But I'm gonna go backwards on this one with the most recent events. So the Ocean Protection Council just had a meeting where they were proposing some funding packages for the a few different programs, including some data monitoring for marine protected areas, from like ROV, which is like a remote underwater viewing, to a survey habitat and kind of like groundfish stocks within marine protected areas. There's also the California Collaborative Fisheries Research Program, which gets volunteers out fishing in MPAs. And so there's a package of money that was just voted on to support that data collection, that citizen science, that really important adaptive management of the network. And that's something that BHA commented in support of. And that funding was actually awarded from the OPC. That's like a cabinet level state agency. And so the reason why I mention that is that BHA does not have a blanket opposition to all MPAs. We, like pretty much any policy stance, we try to have a pretty nuanced perspective to look at the data and the analytics of what science is telling us should drive policy, especially when it comes to hunting and fishing and any potential closures. So the closures that we're looking at right now are a series of petitions that are submitted to the Fish and Game Commission. These came at the end of the decadal management review of the Marine Protected Area Network, which, after the network was initially established, they said, we're going to do a 5-year review and a 10-year review. And at that point, then we'll look at adaptive management and any potential changes to the network. So they kind of held off any of the petitions to change it until that point, and that's why we had this kind of onslaught of proposals all to the Fish and Game Commission, who has the authority to make those changes to the network. And this all was because of legislation that was passed. And so, that was the initial catalyst and the driver for the whole MPA network. So where we're at is there's a series of petitions that are seeking to close large portions of our coastline to fishing, commercial and recreational. of all types. And, MPAs have various levels of restriction. Some of them state marine reserves allow no take. Some of them state marine conservation areas allow limited take. And each one is different. No two are the same. But the reason why BHA has opposed a number of these proposals is that, it is our perspective from what we've reviewed and the perspective of a lot of partners in this space, that the data that is being presented by the petitioners, and these are petitions coming from, other NGOs primarily, that are, oftentimes more on like the left-leaning side, more environmental NGOs that are advocating for MPAs because they're arguing this is, essential for ocean conservation. Um, our perspective is that a lot of these lack the foundational data and support from research to justify closing an entire stretch of ocean indefinitely, to all take for all species, for all people. That just is a really broad brush stroke to management, and it's not how we typically address these types of things. We usually look at threats to individual species, and for instance, if a particular species is not doing well, i.e., salmon, which has been closed the last 2 years, we close the season, or we reduce the bag limits, or we manage the pressures of hunting and fishing in this case, to ensure that that species is going to be able to recover sustainably. An MPA is just a blanket closure, and once they're established, there's no precedent in California of them ever getting opened back up.
I think it's, when I talk about something like a marine protected area, which has a really nice ring to it for people that don't know much about fishing. There's and I also, just sharing my own personal perspective, am not against MPAs as a whole. I share BHA's perspective that this is a nuanced issue and you should have science lead policy. To take even one step further back into a more of a philosophical conversation, tell me about the preservationist principle versus active management.
So the preservationist principle is essentially, if we remove humans from the equation, nature is going to sort things out. That essentially the balance of nature, whatever is going wrong, that getting humans out of the picture, things are just going to naturally resolve themselves, and then will kind of be restored to the level that we want. I think there are instances and elements where that can certainly be true. I think there are plenty of instances where that is not true. And it's a really stark contrast from terrestrial issues and management compared to marine issues, and how we look at our species and what we're doing to conserve habitat and manage for those species. So for instance, BHA has been working at the Hialeah Junction Wildlife Area to plant 20,000 bitterbrush plugs and several thousand species of cultural significance to the Washoe tribe over the last several years to restore winter range for mule deer and antelope that has burned in pretty large scale fires and then has been replaced by invasives like cheatgrass. Once invasives come in, that cycle of fire and burn and invasives, it just gets exacerbated. It just repeats because the invasives allow the fires to burn hotter, and those natives have a harder time coming back. And so the cheatgrass just spreads. So what we're doing is we're going in there and we're removing cheatgrass and planting the native species that the mule deer and pronghorn rely on to survive, and that they need for their winter range. Now, that happens all over in many different aspects on our public lands and and even in the private sector, managing for wildlife and habitat is a huge industry, and it's critically important not just for game species but for endangered species as well. In the oceans, we really don't do that, hardly at all. There's a few kind of pilot studies out there, but we don't go in and adaptively manage habitat the same way that we do. The whole concept of an MPA is that we're going to draw a line in the map and we're not going to touch it. We're going to study it. We're not going to allow any fishing. There's no like water quality component to an MPA, so that's a whole nother story. But there are, the main mechanism for an MPA is just restricting fishing. And the idea is that everything is going to get better and fish stocks are going to be replenished and there will be spillover from within inside the MPA to out. And that's, I think to be determined. And I think it really depends on the siting of the MPA and the surrounding habitat and areas as far as what the spillover impacts are, if there are any, and how that MPA is going to impact fisheries and surrounding habitat and ecosystems. So that's the piece of the data puzzle that I think we need more local science to demonstrate what those impacts are. And I would say more hands-on habitat restoration, things like going in and smashing purple urchins that are 6,000 times what they should be in some of these areas where there's just entire urchin barrens that have dominated and there's no other chance for kelp to come back. If there's not kelp, there's not going to be abalone. You know what I mean? And these things have come about because we have warming events. You've got, sea star wasting disease that wipes out an entire population. Then you have all the urchins come back. And if we don't go in and do something about that, it's going to take a very, very long time for that ecosystem to recover. Maybe it's possible, but maybe not in the time scale that we all would want to see as hunters and anglers and conservationists.
Sure. And does BHA organize urchin culling? Has that happened in the past?
Does BHA do it, you said?
Yeah.
We haven't. Oh, well, actually, we have. Not on a large scale, but we've done a cool event called our Catch and Cook competition, where we got people together in Monterey. About 20 folks go out and spearfish. They come back before noon or so. They have to cook their catch before a panel of judges. And then we had like a ton of different prizes for those folks. But there's also been two other aspects of that event. One of them was an urchin culling incentive. So for people that went out and culled purple urchins, they were entered into a special raffle. And then also like a beach cleanup. So for kids and families that were just there, weren't trying to get in the water, they could participate by picking up trash along the beach. And then for every bucket of trash, they got entered into their own special raffle. So people won a lot of really cool prizes just for participating in conservation in different ways.
So someone may say, another big difference between terrestrial species and ocean species is that we no longer have market hunting on land, which brought many of these species, bison, white-tailed deer, turkey, to near extinction at one point. And as a result of this conservation model, these species have now come back. They're being managed, and that's an ongoing process, species to species. We don't have those protections for ocean species on a commercial level, and it's very possible that within the next 100 years, our oceans will just be fish dry on some level, globally. Like, how would you take on that argument that this is a time for really dramatic action? This isn't a time to just kind of wait and see the science, but we actually need to do large scale MPAs because this is a 5-alarm fire, so to speak, in the oceans.
Well, I think my first reaction is that I would not cut the funding and staff for NOAA and all the federal agencies that have had their staffing cut. There's been some interesting reporting coming out from researchers and scientists that are saying, look, if you cut everyone at NOAA, these are the people that are doing the stock assessments that manage our fisheries. So if we don't have accurate data, we're not going to be able to manage our fisheries to the extent that we need to ensure that they're sustainably harvested. Maybe that means that there's overharvesting. Maybe that means they just cut out, you stop fishing, right? Because you don't have the right data to be able to prove it. Neither of those things are good scenarios. So we need these people doing this work, which is why I mentioned, in that very small example of the Ocean Protection Council funding for those programs that BHA advocated for, because like that is so important to this, right? The science has to guide.
And I don't want to speak out of turn here, but I would imagine that the people proposing these MPAs would also support NOAA researchers.
I think so. I think there's no reason why.
That seems like even the people who are kind of fighting amongst themselves around the California MPA issue are all like, no, we need to see when the storms are coming in. We need to see if these species are still around. Like that feels like, I don't know. I haven't asked everyone, but that seems pretty unanimously stupid to do.
I think the other one that everyone agrees on is water quality, right? Like we've literally dumped in hundreds of millions of gallons of raw sewage into our oceans in the last several years. I'm talking like the last 5 years. Hundreds of millions of gallons of raw sewage up and down the coast. Multiple events, relatively easily and preventable infrastructure failures. Like marine protected areas do nothing to solve that. We've, had a number of different sewage spill incidences into MPAs that we are saying these are conserved land or conserved waters. I just disagree. And I think the majority of the conservation community, whether you're on the hook and bullet side or the environmental side, agrees that that is not a positive thing, that we all need a better solution there. I think that, to get into like the MPA differences there, that like where people tend to kind of like split off, it's really a philosophical divide around, I think, just the idea of harvesting food. The whole concept of like market fishing is so different from market hunting, and you're right, like that was the inflection point for how we managed to really get back on track and to restore a huge number of these species from the brink of extinction on the terrestrial side.
And maybe feel free to just give a minute or two for people who don't understand what happened. Give the elevator pitch for around what happened through the 1800s.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we got to the point where we had unregulated hunting. We literally shot bison down to, a handful of bison, and white-tailed deer, as you mentioned, and turkeys were all like, being extirpated from regions, and, significantly impacted to the point where, like, if we had kept going down that route, I think we would have seen extinctions, potentially. And so, around the turn of the century, we realized that, hey, we need to stop market hunting, and we need to start to prioritize conservation and management of species. And, that's where the concept of trophy hunting originated, which is, I think, something that people really don't understand, is that, the idea of selecting the larger males came from wanting to let more of the younger species breed and to have more prolific wildlife. And so if you're selecting for the older male, you're going to give more of the younger males a better chance to breed. You're going to have more genetic diversity, and the species is going to like build back quicker. And so that has stayed with hunting, and has a completely different connotation these days of like, trophy hunter is like kind of a bad word, and is certainly wielded by the anti-hunting community. But, in its essence, it's not necessarily a bad thing at all, and oftentimes it's a good thing for conservation if someone wants to go out there and be highly selective about what they shoot and to not shoot the first 10 animals that they see, because they want to select for a particular species for whatever their reason, um, or not a species, but a particular size or characteristic. And so I'd say, yeah, I guess just to put a final point on that thought, the North American model of conservation where we have tags and licenses and people paying into the system has been instrumental, and it's lauded by and looked favorably upon by really like the world as this model that has allowed turkeys and deer and elk, um, and moose and all these different species to come back from levels that really I don't think people at that turn of the century realized would have been possible in 100 years. But we are, really living in the golden age there for hunting. When you look at like how many of these different species there are on the landscape,
Mm.
and that's what we're trying to keep on the landscape.
Mm. And when it comes to your perspective on the difference that we are when it comes to commercial fishing today versus market hunting 100 years ago, um, has BHA ever taken a stance against commercial fishing in certain areas? What's your perspective on the best way to um, ensure that that species will not be going extinct, that commercial fishing interests don't uh, take over?
That's a tough one. Um, we've typically stayed out of that conversation. One, because the organization is still relatively young, and there are a whole lot of priority issues that tend to take the primary focus, and
Sure.
so the organization is incredibly busy with all of those priorities and impacts to public lands, waters, and wildlife. And so I would say historically, BHA has not weighed in on as many of the coastal conservation issues, although over the last few years, with added capacity and just interest from, I would say me personally, but also, my counterpart on the East, Chris Borgatti, is also very knowledgeable on fisheries and coastal issues. And so I think he and I have kind of waded into those waters a little bit more, but from a commercial perspective, we're always going to advocate for a science-based management of the resource. So we haven't historically gotten into that too much, but I think to kind of like bring it back to MPAs, the piece that I would mention is that, they're restricting access for the person who is going and shore fishing for kelp perch or um sargo or any of the number of species that are not commercially targeted, and they're doing that from a recreational standpoint to feed their family, probably not harvesting very many, particularly those species that a lot of people just throw back anyway. Like, to eliminate that access for an MPA, not only are you eliminating this like connection to the ocean and this person who is paying into the system, who's passionate about conservation, who is an advocate, you're severing that connection for families to go and experience this, for communities to do this together, to share this food. Um, but you're also eliminating data
Mm.
that, these creel surveys and different types of surveys that the department does oftentimes is like the only data that they're getting to understand fish stocks for some of these fish that are not commercially targeted, that are not targeted by like party boats, from a recreational fishing perspective. And so I think, you know, the spear fishermen or the shore fishermen, fly fishermen going after Corbina, whatever it is, like these are the impacts from MPAs that I think are just like the most egregious to me, where there's no clear threat to the species. These are not like highly targeted fish, but the repercussions are really significant. I think from a cultural standpoint, and that's again like once we lose that, it's really hard. It's kind of seemingly impossible to come back. And these are, traditions that have existed for a very, very long time, right? Like dating back well before, like European ancestors came to the Americas, right? We've been fishing and foraging along the coastlines. And losing that connection is significant. And these MPAs also restrict access for, non-federally recognized tribes. And I think that's a significant piece to recognize is that if you're not a federally recognized tribe, you don't have a pathway to accessing, ancestral fishing and foraging along the coast for a marine protected area.
Let's talk about the checkerboard. What is the
Corner crossing?
Yes.
Yeah. So today, March 18th, is a very significant day for public land owners across North America, across the nation. BHA's slogan at times is we're all public land owners, right? We are all owners of the federal public lands, and this is our inheritance, and it's our duty to be good stewards of that. And so, those public lands managed by the federal government exist across the nation in a large percentage in the West. And in many of these areas, we've got this checkerboard pattern of public-private ownership of lands. And that is really a vestige of kind of like westward expansion and railroads and how lands were carved up at the time. And so what it's led to is in today's day and age, you have this checkerboard where you got public, private, public, private. And in a lot of states, by default, the public has not been able to access millions of acres of those public lands because they're in this checkerboard pattern. And it has been, kind of unknown or societally frowned upon, or certain places, people would argue that you are not allowed to go from one corner to another corner, accessing public land to public land, literally just stepping over the corner, never setting foot on private land, that was in somehow illegal, and that you wouldn't be able to access those public lands. This came to a head several years ago when 4 hunters did that very thing. They even actually purchased a ladder, brought the ladder to the corner, hopped over the corner with the ladder, and then were accused of trespassing, criminal and civil, from the private landowner, the Iron Bar Ranch, who argued that their act of traversing through his airspace caused $7 million worth of damage to his ranch, his airspace. Really, because he had complete private access to the public lands. They were essentially his lands. No one else could go there. And so the criminal charges were dropped pretty quickly. The $7 million claim was dropped pretty quickly, but the case moved on, went to district court. The judge in district court ruled that the public does, in fact, have a right to access public land from accessible corners, as long as you're not setting foot on private lands. And that dates back to an old 1800s law of the Unlawful Enclosures Act, which I won't go down that rabbit hole, but it's kind of interesting that old precedent is still holding strong to allow for public access to public lands. And so the owner of the private property appealed to the 10th Circuit, and BHA, from the beginning, helped to fundraise. So we raised over $200,000 for the 4 hunters who were accused for their legal defenses. We submitted amicus briefs in the first case and also the second case in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. And that 10th Circuit decision, after almost a year, finally dropped today, affirming the lower court's ruling and cementing the legality of accessing public land from adjoining corners, as long as you're not stepping foot on private lands. And that's a significant win in the 10th Circuit that impacts literally millions of acres of public lands, which is just, I think when you try to frame that, it's just it's a huge win and something that we're really excited about. And so that's a legal precedent that the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals covers Colorado, Kansas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Utah, and Wyoming. And Wyoming is where really this all kind of came to a head, and where the Wyoming Chakra BHA kind of spearheaded the efforts to ensure public access to public lands for everybody. It doesn't matter if you hunt, fish, whatever you want to do, it's public lands for everybody.
It's yours.
Right, it's your inheritance.
Yeah. Man, you're doing such good work. I really appreciate you laying it all out for me. And big win. I think we should let's finish off there with a celebration. Amidst a lot of bad news, there's a lot of good news too, and you guys are a part of the good news.
Try, man. Yeah, and I'll do my my ploy for support here, right? Like and if you want to get involved in conservation, there's no better time than now. And I'd say BHA is a really fantastic organization because we empower people to focus on the issues and the projects that they're passionate about that fit within the umbrella of BHA. But if you want to go out and plant native plants to restore habitat, like we can make that project happen. With a little elbow grease. Like if you want to advocate for legislation or show up in Congress, like there's a pathway for that too. And so I think I would just encourage people that are interested to go to the website, become a member. Really keeps the lights on for us, but also just kind of like figure out what you're passionate about and start there. And it can be sort of intimidating at first, but it's a super amazing community that with a huge tent, right? Like there's space for everybody. And that's my favorite thing about the organization is that, and what I think really sets us apart is that we exist in that space that can allow for a more, traditional environmentalist or really like hardcore conservative to come together, have a beer, stick a bitter brush plant in the ground, or, work on whatever project or call whatever representative to advocate to the things that we all, agree are important and that we don't want to lose.
I'm a member. I'm an
Oh, yeah.
active member, and I would love to go out and plant some bitter brush sometime. So we'll stay in touch. Let's go for a hunt. Let's go for a surf, and really appreciate you, man. Great job.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate you having me on.